Hello, I'm John. Welcome back. So I've got 6 books to share with you today that I've finished over the past couple of weeks, and 3 of them are fiction, 3 of them are nonfiction, and I didn't plan it that way. That's just the way it worked out. So the first book I read was The Boats of the Glen Carrig by William Hope Hodgson. This is from 1907, and William Hope Hodgson is, of course, an important name in the history of the weird tale, but his writing style is really um, very old-fashioned even for his time, and he was doing that on purpose, I think. Although I don't really understand why he would have done that, because I think if he had written in a contemporary fashion of his time, his books would have been better. They would have certainly been more readable and less detached from the story going on. So this book is told from the perspective of a survivor of a shipwreck, and it is told in the style of the 1700s, and he is dictating this to his nephew. So it's all in first person, but it has that weird detachment of a 1700s narrative. So, like, sailors aren't referred to by name, and the main character is actually the bosun, and he's never referred to by name. He's just called the bosun throughout. And we're not really, we never really feel like we're a part of this. It's a very detached narrative. And the basic plot is that the Glen Carrig wrecks, and they escape in these boats on the open ocean, and they come to one strange land after another, trying to find food and water and shelter and everything. So the first place they come to is a barren land. It's just kind of gray and muddy everywhere as far as they can see. And they go up a river hoping to find, trees and people and whatever. They don't find anything like that. It's just more mud and these weird shrub things. And they come to a ship, and they stay on the ship. And the first night they're there, there's this terrible wailing, and they don't know what's causing it. And one of the sailors finds a manuscript and reads about what happened to the people on this ship. And they experience the same thing, the same wailing and these weird things trying to get into the ship. They don't see them, but they hear them trying to get in. And then they go off onto land and try to find water. So they leave basic information about where this water is. So the contemporary shipwreck survivors go off to find this water. And instead, all they find is a campsite and more of these weird shrub things. And it quickly becomes apparent that the weird shrub things are actually the people from the ship. So they get back in their boats and row away and back onto the ocean. And from there, they go into a section of the sea that is completely covered in seaweed, this weird seaweed. And there are weird creatures in the seaweed. There's like giant crabs, and there are these weird creatures that look kind of like people, but they have beaks, and they try to attack them, and there are these, what are they called in the book? They're called, they're not squid, but they kind of look like squid. I can't remember exactly what they're called. And they're huge, and they attack them with their tentacles and stuff, and they find land, and they go off onto this land, and they feel pretty safe. They're still scared. They need to figure out a way how to get off this island and back home. But there's not really anything on the island except reeds and some parts of shipwrecked, or flotsam and jetsam, that kind of thing. And eventually they become aware that there is a ship out way far out from shore. So a lot of time is spent in this book, William Hope Hodgson, explaining how this bow was created. They create a giant bow to shoot an arrow with a rope on it out to this ship. And the people living on this ship have been there for 7 years, which seems pretty crazy, but it's a big ship, lots of stores, and that part was kind of unbelievable to me, even though I know people have survived out on the sea for many years at a time. 7 years kind of seemed to be stretching it to me. And eventually, of course, they are attacked by a giant crab, and then they are attacked by more of these weird human-like creatures with beaks that come on land, and they're described as being kind of like slugs mixed with people. They don't make any sound at all, and yeah, it's a wild story. And there's a really kind of hokey romance thrown into this towards the end, which was had kind of that Milady kind of tint to it, that unrealistic sort of Victorian romance sort of thing. Uh, so it was okay. I enjoyed it. I really liked the premise much more than I liked the execution. I liked the weird creatures in the seaweed, the weird wailing in the fungi people and the giant crabs. But the book itself is not. It took me a long time to get through this because the writing style itself is just not compelling. It's detached. It's I would say kind of overwritten. I just feel like it would have been better served by having a more expressive narrative style than it had, because I feel like that weird 18th century detachment style really marred this story. I mean, that's just my opinion, but that's the way I felt about it. Okay, so the next book, we're all adults here. I'm going to trust that we can all be adults about this. So the next book that I read was Deliverance by James Dickey. You got your Jon Voight and your Burt Reynolds there on the cover. I was trying to figure out why Burt Reynolds has always looked weird to me in Deliverance, and it's because he's missing his mustache. I finally figured that out one day, that he doesn't have his mustache and he looks kind of weird. I'm so used to seeing him with a mustache. But anyway, so I'm guessing most people know what this is about. James Dickey was a poet, and I think this is the only novel he ever wrote. It's really good. So beyond the obvious thing that I'm kind of skirting around here at the moment, this is a really well-written, interesting novel. It's a very beautifully written novel, and I know you're thinking, how is that possible? Well, it just is. The descriptions James Dickey makes about these middle-aged men, about how they think and how they feel and how they see. So it's told from the first person perspective of Ed, which is Jon Voight's character. And Ed is asked by his friend Lewis to go along on this canoeing trip down the Cohahlawasi River. I think it's in Georgia. I'm not sure if it's ever said explicitly where this takes place, but I'm pretty sure it takes place in Georgia. And they're kind of city boys, really. Now, Lewis is all into, that's Burt Reynolds' character, he's all into improving himself physically, mentally, learning skills, learning how to bow hunt, how to canoe, and be in the woods and working out. And he's just physically ripped. And there are two other people, just kind of acquaintances with them, who are going to go on this trip, and they know them from around, they're all into different businesses and things like that. Jon Voight. So Ed, the main character, is the vice president of a photography agency that does ads, I believe, and he knows Lewis pretty well, but he doesn't know the other two guys very much at all. And so on the way there, Ed and Lewis have this conversation about Lewis believes that everything is about to fall apart, that society is about to fall apart. Maybe the Soviets and the Americans are going to get into a war, and he wants to survive that. He wants to be physically and mentally fit enough to survive that. So he's a planner. He plans for these things. And he says that there are, I think, three or four different kinds of people There are people who are going to be thrust into this situation of survival and rise to the challenge with an unknown inner strength. And then there are people who will try to make it, but they won't. And then there are people who will just basically lay down and give up. And that premise is tested in this book very seriously. So the part that I'm dancing around here is that they go down the river and they tie up someplace. I think it's their second day on the river. And so Ed and a guy named Bobby go up on shore and they wander off into the woods a little ways. And they run into two violent hillbillies, and Ed is tied up and Bobby is raped at gunpoint. And then as they are turning to focus their attentions on Ed, Lewis kills one of them with an arrow. And the other guy runs away. So now, even though it was an act of self-defense, Lewis shot the guy through the back with the arrow. So if they go and report this to the police, there's going to be a trial, all kinds of things. They're going to have to explain why Lewis killed him the way he did. And it breaks out into an argument between them about whether to turn this into the police or not. And eventually they decide to cover this up. And then they have to get down the rest of the river. They're still several days from their destination. They're in the middle of nowhere, and they have to get down the river. And they think they're going to make it out, and one of them gets killed. One of them gets shot and killed. And the rest of the book is Ed trying to find a way to save his friends and still get out of this, and still get out of it without having to go to trial, without having to they just want to put this behind them and go on with their lives, basically. But it is a really, really well-written book, and I don't, the scene that, of the rape is over. It only lasts about 2 pages of this entire book, and it's not explicit or anything like that. It's violent and disturbing, but it's not explicit. But just the way that James Dickey talks about the river, he talks about these men's lives, how they're dealing with their lives, how they are handling being husbands and fathers and businessmen, and how they respond to this event, how they respond to the river, is really, really interesting. And the way that Ed kind of looks down on the hill people, they have to get up to this place. So Ed, the whole way there, is thinking about how meaningless and terrible the lives of these hillbillies must be. But at the same time, I kind of felt like it was an expression of the way he felt about his own life, about how despite living in the city, despite having a nice house and a wife and a son and enough money to have this kind of not exactly a luxury life, but a leisurely life, there is still something missing from his life. And I think he's kind of projecting that onto these poor hillbillies, I think it's kind of what he feels about himself and his own life. And he talks about that, about these in-between moments where his life just seems to be a waste and to have no meaning. But anyway, it's just a really, I know you're expecting it to not be very good, to be just kind of a gimmicky book or whatever, or just to hinge around that one incident. It's really well written, and it's very beautifully written in places, but I can totally see why it wouldn't be for everybody. Yeah, so that is Deliverance by James Dickey. So the next book is Ghost Boy by Gene Simon. I'm pretty sure I got this in my second ever book haul on this channel. It was right after I started. I think it was like my fourth or fifth video. And what it's about is so it's about an 11-year-old girl, her sister who is 15, and their mother. And so her father had been having an affair on their mother and had been living off and on with this other woman for a year. Her mother found out and divorced the father and took the two girls away to a city about 100 and some odd miles inland in California. The 11-year-old girl meets some other girls and they decide, well, one of them is really mean. She decides to play a prank on the girl, takes her to makes her sneak out of her house in the middle of the night, and they all go to the cemetery together, and then they leave her there, and she panics and runs through the cemetery and smacks her head on a tombstone, and then a ghost boy appears to her, and she can't figure out what he wants. He doesn't speak, and he just fades away. And so a lot of this book is her trying to figure out what the ghost boy wants, why he's there. So she keeps going back to the cemetery at night. And at the same time, there was a series of child murders in the past, and they have started up again. And so she becomes aware of that this dead boy is probably one of the victims of this killer somehow. And so this book is set up in a way that's very promising. But, about a third of the way in, I started to realize that one of the characters in particular is probably the murderer. And I wasn't wrong about that. But I was kind of annoyed by that because it was exactly the character you think it is, despite there being a couple of red herrings. And I was thinking, as the book went on, I was thinking, please don't have it be this character, because it's too obvious. It's like a B movie. And if you make the murderer be this character, you are just taking the easy way out. And, at the same time, the mother is working for this doctor, and he's very nice. The 15-year-old girl is taking care of this older lady's son. He has a lot of physical issues, so he doesn't leave the house or anything anymore, and he's described as being very creepy. And in the middle of all this, the divorced ex-husband, the father of the two girls, comes back. And that was really irritating too, because the mother should have nothing to do with this guy, like he's a scumbag. But she starts to fall for him again. And it just has all those kind of B-movie issues that go exactly where you think they're going to. And it was an enjoyable read. It just had so much promise that was unfulfilled. And it went down all the cliched, kind of lazy routes that you think it's going to. And that just kind of bothered me, because I really think this could have been a pretty good book other than that. So the next book I read was Corregidor, The End of the Line by Eric Morris. This was really good. So at the same time the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7th, they also invaded the Philippines. And for a couple of months, the soldiers on the Philippines were basically on their own. The people of the Philippines were completely on their own during this invasion. And basically there was no way for the U.S. to save them, so they just kind of wrote them off, unfortunately. And that's kind of why it's been brushed under the carpet. So this is told from interviews, or told through interviews with the survivors, mostly Americans, in fact almost entirely Americans. It's very long and there's a lot of detail, so it was slow going. And it documents the kind of disbelief that they started with at first. They thought that the the radio reports of the attack on Pearl Harbor were just kind of like a radio show. They didn't realize it was real, and then the Japanese started to invade the Philippines, and they had old weapons that were basically useless. They were still transporting things with horses. There weren't enough trucks, and they just really did not have the right weapons, and they just weren't able to defend the Philippines for very long. So basically, the Philippines is made up of islands, of course, and Corregidor is a very small island in, I think it's at the mouth of Manila Bay. My geography of the Philippines is not too good. So, of course, this photo is from the Bataan Death March. So a large amount of the soldiers surrendered and were marched through the Bataan Peninsula and put into camps and treated absolutely horrendously by the Japanese for 3 years. And a lot of that is on show here, the brutality of the Japanese soldiers. So eventually the only Allied forces still standing in the Philippines were the people on Corregidor. It was this very heavily fortified island, and thousands of people got onto this island, and they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough water, they didn't have enough like artillery shells to fight off the Japanese. So it was just a matter of time before this siege would be ended and they would all become prisoners. And a lot of them would die in the interim between, you know, their surrender and their liberation. And some of that is documented, but the last 100 pages are about the prison camps and that kind of thing. And it also speaks really well of General Wainwright, and it does what most people do, which is to say that Douglas MacArthur was basically a useless bastard who sat in his dugout. They called him Dugout Doug because he hardly ever went out to the front lines. He sat in his house, he sat in his bunker, and then he, of course, was ordered by the president to leave the Philippines. So one night he snuck out of the Philippines, basically, and you can say he was ordered, but you know, my personal opinions about MacArthur are pretty low. I find him to be well, like I said, a worthless glory hound bastard who sent other men to their deaths for his own name and reputation. And yeah, I don't have many good things to say about Douglas MacArthur. But anyway, my point is, this was a really good book. And if you're looking for a book about the invasion of the Philippines, this would be a good one to read because, I mean, this is extremely detailed. It starts at the beginning and it goes all the way till the end. So, yeah. The next book I read was A Coffin for King Charles by C.V. Wedgwood. There's King Charles I, and I think that's supposed to be Oliver Cromwell, but it's not the best representation of Cromwell I've ever seen. So anyway, kind of looks more like Shakespeare than Cromwell, doesn't it? Kind of. So we start out with King Charles. He has been a prisoner for almost 2 years, and basically this is about the show trial where King Charles I was not allowed a defense. He was not even really allowed to speak. They tried to keep him from speaking. And basically, I don't really understand what started the English Civil War, so I jumped into this in this book. I think this is the third book in a series of the English Civil War that C.V. Wedgwood wrote. Her books are hard to find, so I very rarely ever find them, or I'd have started at the beginning. But this is just really a really good book. And it is this basic argument between the rebels who have beat the royalist forces and sent Charles's son into exile, or well, he went into exile because he had no choice, and So I'm not exactly sure about what started the English Civil War, or what it was really about, but I do know that the people who rebelled against Charles and came to this point to put him on trial basically decided they knew that they could not let Charles out of this, that they were going to have a trial under English law, but Charles argued that because he had no peer, because he was the King of England, the people had absolutely no right to put him on trial, which apparently, I'm not sure, but that seems to be the case. And basically, this is just them pretending to use the law to judge Charles and execute him, to make it seem like it was done under the law. That's my understanding of it. I'm probably wrong about that. Like I said, I've read it just because it was entertaining. And we get a really interesting look at Charles's captivity and into him as a person. And this mostly focuses on him and on his experience from his 2 years in captivity, or his 2 years in prison, basically. It was a nice prison, but it was still prison. And his execution. I don't know enough about it to really make a comment on it. I just know that it seems like, well, it seems kind of like a farce. It seems like they were trying to use an English law that didn't support their case, and they forced it through, and they executed King Charles I. So I don't know if they were wrong or right in their desires for this civil war. I have no idea, unfortunately. I just know that this was a really, really good book, and I enjoyed it. So the next book I read was Lincoln on the Verge by Ted Widmer. And this is also a really good book. And in fact, I've kind of had trouble starting another book lately because I've read two really good books back to back, and everything else will probably be disappointing for a little while. So this focuses on the 13 days of Lincoln's trip from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. so that he can be inaugurated. And so it really starts at the election day. So when Lincoln finds out he is to be the next president, thanks to the telegraph. So it is about the trip that Lincoln and his family took, and some of his employees and friends took on these trains to get from Springfield to Washington, D.C. It took 13 days. He saw thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. He made many, many, many speeches all over the place. Sometimes at little villages, the train would slow down. He would give a 5-minute speech and go away. And then all these hands he had to shake, all the people who nearly crushed him trying to get to him, and all the people, the reporters who either thought he was a great man or who did very little except judge him by his appearance and by his clothes. And, you know, some of the things they said were just incredibly demeaning and insulting, all based on his appearance. Had very little to do with him as a person because they didn't really know him as a person. And Lincoln's election is kind of an oddity, how that happened, you know. That Lincoln became president is rather an odd twist of fate in and of itself. And yeah, I just really like this. To read a good book about Lincoln is to feel yourself in the presence of a great man. I don't know how to explain that, but there was something very special about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, I tend to think that Lincoln, the politician, did a few things on purpose. Like, we are always told that he dressed kind of like a clodhopper. Basically, his pants were too short, his hat was too big, the cut of his jacket was wrong. I kind of wonder if Lincoln did that on purpose because he knew that if people developed a certain idea of him, they would underestimate him as a politician. And many, many people underestimated Abraham Lincoln as a politician. And that was a mistake. And that book, the book doesn't focus on that. That's really later on. It was just a really good book. And of course, there are people who are trying to see to it that he never makes it to Washington, D.C., people who want to kill him, particularly in Baltimore. So, and at the same time, we get a parallel trip that's going on. It's not a big part of the book, but it is. We get flashes of it, of Jefferson Davis's trip to Richmond. And, of course, one of the strange things about the Civil War is that Washington, D.C. and the capital of the Confederacy are only, I think, 90 miles away, something like that. So D.C. is just a little bit north of Richmond. And you kind of wonder why they didn't just mass all their forces on Richmond. But anyway, so we also get to see a lot of the people who came in contact with Lincoln or indirectly in contact with Lincoln through this trip. So other presidents, John Tyler, William Howard Taft, James Garfield, etc. And Ted Widmer talks about the area also and the people in the area. And it seems like there's too much information sometimes, but what he's trying to do is build a case or build a picture of the United States at this period in time. I think he did a really good job of it. So we also have a lot of pictures. There are a lot of pictures in this book of people who might have seen or who did come in contact with Lincoln on this trip. So there's Andrew Carnegie and his brother, Frederick Douglass at one point. I think I already said William Howard Taft. He'd have been very young at that time, still a baby, really. There's Grover Cleveland. He might have even been seen by John Wilkes Booth at one point somewhere in New York. This book does a really good job of showing Lincoln as a person, and I think that's kind of where Lincoln shines the best, is that regardless of what book you read about him, he always comes through as an intensely human character. So I didn't think I was going to enjoy this book. I really didn't, because, I mean, so this book has been remaindered, and it kind of has a sort of a cheap feeling cover to it, a cheap looking cover to it. So I thought maybe it wouldn't be very good. I was completely wrong about that. I judged this book completely wrong. I really, really enjoyed this, and it's a really interesting look at the completely exhausting, frightening trip that Lincoln took on these 13 days. And I'd recommend it to anybody interested in Lincoln. I just thought it was really good. So that's what I've been reading over the past couple of weeks. Right now I'm reading Submarine by Edward L. Beach. This is an account of his time with Trigger, the USS Trigger, and also his just him talking about other submarines, what they went through, the people on board, and A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. I think this is supposed to be the worst translation. It's actually kind of a rewrite of the book, from what I understand. I was trying to find the Malleson translation, and I just couldn't find a copy, so I just decided to reread this one again. I think this is the third or fourth time I've read it. So anyway, that's what I've been reading, and I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.